Hello, everyone tuning in with us today for day 3 of the 2021 Dismantle Preservation Unconference. The goal of this event is to amplify historically excluded narratives, raise awareness for structures and places which have not necessarily been a part of the preservation lexicon, and to amplify new and emerging voices. Really excited to have you all here with us today. The event is free thanks to the support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Norm and Eileen Tyler, and also Museum Hack. And while the event is free, you're encouraged to support any of our 5 designated nonprofits or charities who are doing work to transform the field of historic preservation in meaningful ways. These groups are Asian and Pacific Islanders in Historic Preservation, Latinos in Heritage Conservation, House of Tulip, the Decay Devils, and also the Apache Passion Project, which actually somewhat connects to our first lightning talk this afternoon. The Apache Passion Project works to install skateboard parks across Navajo Nation because we want to preserve spaces so that people want to live in them at all stages of their lives. We're gonna start out our first presentation from Maya, and then we're gonna move on to the Cats of Brutalism team. Please share your thoughts, questions, concerns in the chat box or use the Q&A. We'll have a moderated Q&A following our back-to-back presentations. And again, thank you so much, all of you, for being here today and to wanting to expand your preservation toolkit. Maya, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Go ahead and get started here. All right, so I want to welcome everyone today. We're going to be talking about skate spots, skate parks a little bit, and the push to protect public spaces and preserve the grind. So I want to start off by telling you a little bit more about myself and how I became so interested in this topic. So I'm Maya Haptas. My pronouns are she, her. And early in my career, I actually worked with the American Institute of Architects for a number of years, and that led me to go back to school and actually get my graduate degree in historic preservation planning, which I did in 2008. And following that, I worked for a long time in nonprofit community development, primarily in business district planning and Main Street development. And then I moved into freelance writing. And so as I was doing more freelance writing in 2018, at the age of 39, I actually learned to skateboard with my 6-year-old son. And from that experience, I founded an events-based company called Shred Your Fears, which teaches women to skateboard. So we've actually taught over 250 women to skateboard all across North America, ages 11 to 72. We're based in Pittsburgh, but we travel for events a lot. And so through that process of traveling to events, I was experiencing a lot of different places that were skatable. I was always bringing my skateboard, going to skate parks. And I began to get really interested in issues of public space design and use and how that related to architecture and planning and tied in with the skateboarding community that I was being exposed to and really kind of falling in love with. And I saw that there were a number of efforts to preserve skate spots, and that these efforts brought up a lot of common questions that preservationists grapple with. And I really found this to be an interesting lens to be able to explore those issues. So skateboarding is a really incredibly accessible sport. It can take place almost anywhere. And so as a jumping off point, I wanted to spend some time really categorizing what are the different types of spaces we're talking about, and talk a little bit about why they may or may not be worthy of saving. So what we would talk about, like a skate spot or an existing spot, could be almost anything. So that could be like a particularly good curb in a part of a neighborhood that people go and skate at, or as for example, we would say about the skate spot near me, that part of the parking lot next to the car wash behind the Wendy's, which is where a lot of people go down the street from me here in Pittsburgh. So it can really encompass a lot of really different things. And then DIY spots, which we're going to talk about primarily today, are becoming increasingly common as skateboarding gains popularity. And this is where skaters really begin to actively change the space and change the use of the space, and then start to make either temporary or permanent changes. So the photo you actually see here is of me skating in Toronto at Christie Pits, which is a DIY spot that's in a hockey rink. And the skaters actually share the space with the hockey players. So it's still used for ice hockey in the winter. And all of the obstacles are temporary and can be moved. So then we have skate parks, which are probably what you think of most commonly, right? They're the spaces that are designed, they're usually exclusively designed for the purposes of skateboarding or similar sports like BMX bike or roller skating or roller blading. These can be privately owned, but primarily there's probably a couple in public parks in your town. And generally, these spaces are not as susceptible to being threatened with removal or demolition because they were designed and created and invested in for that intended purpose. So I really want to turn our attention back to those first two that we're going to look at in terms of public space and infrastructure that's being used for skateboarding. However, in general, that wasn't the intended use originally for the space. So to dive in a little deeper, this is a photo of Feral Cat Cove, which is in Portland, Oregon. And so these types of DIY spots are cropping up a lot. This has been happening for a long time, but usually they're cropping up in spaces that are these like in-between spaces or spaces that are no longer used for their intended purposes. So we have a DIY spot in Pittsburgh that's in an old basketball court that just really wasn't being used for basketball anymore. So vacant lots, underpasses, and in a lot of these cases, permanent changes are being made to the space. So the skaters are actually going in and pouring concrete, making their own bowls, making their own ramps. And as sort of a side note, I'm the assistant editor of a Portland-based magazine called Bigfoot Skateboarding Magazine. And so we have our first print issue coming out, and we have a long form article on Feral Cat Cove. And it's really interesting because it dives into how the skaters are also teaching the younger generation that's coming there to skate about, how to pour concrete, helping them gain some of these like masonry skills, and then also how that like teaches them about geometry and all these other kind of associated pieces. So that that is a really kind of interesting side note to all of this. And so some of the common characteristics of these spaces are that, by virtue of their DIY nature and the community-based efforts that have created these spaces, it means that when they are threatened, there's already an engaged community that's generally ready to organize and advocate for its preservation. And I think a really important takeaway here is just to sort of pause and recognize that regardless of what we think a space looks like, whether it's well-designed or whether it conforms to a conventional use, that if it's a space that people have had a role in caretaking and creating, that it warrants at the very least a public process and a community engagement process around its future. So I want to look at two larger, more notable spots today, and that also fit the same characteristics as some of the smaller DIY spots that we talked about. So one is Love Park in Philadelphia that sadly is no longer welcome to skateboarders. And then another is the Undercroft, which is in Southbank Center in London, which was actually preserved for skating. So Love Park is a civic space in Philadelphia, and it's in the center city. It was designed by Edmund Bacon and Vincent Kling, and it was opened in 1965. And so over the years, it became a really popular space to skate. The granite surfaces, the variety of small steps, the rails and the gaps for doing tricks all attracted skateboarders. Skateboarding was banned on and off by the city over the decades. But because of Love Park's popularity, it actually helped to attract the X Games to Philadelphia in 2001 and 2002. Bringing in an estimated $80 million of additional revenue to the city. And so despite all of that, in the year 2000, citing nuisances like damage to the ledges and also the perceived danger to other plaza users, the city of Philadelphia finally and permanently banned skateboarding. And they did this by adding a number of benches and anti-skateboarding measures that removed the naturally skatable features that had been designed originally into the plaza. And so it's worth noting that the counter proposal to that was actually to enhance it for skaters, right? And to enhance the how it had become attractive and sort of naturally evolved into this skatable space. And Edmund Bacon was supportive of that. And because of the multi-purpose nature of the original design. And then in London, we have the Undercroft and Southbank Centre, which was opened in 1967 and had a series of meandering walkways that sat under the elevated entertainment complex. And so these were meant really to serve as experimental public space when the original buildings were completed. And this natural concrete and the banks that were created were immediately attractive to skateboarders. They began flooding the space in the 1970s and bringing what was seen as youthful energy and joy to the open canvas of Southbank Centre's brutalist design. In 2013, Southbank Centre had really become a separate entity, much like a business improvement district we might consider here. So sort of a blend of a public-private partnership. Proposed a €100 renovation to the space that would have turned all of that underneath skatable space into retail units and would have relocated the skaters down the street. So after almost 4 decades, to a newly designed skate park. And so there was really an immediate backlash that resulted in a petition with over 150,000 signatures and many highly visible supporters. Ultimately, because of the public exposure and the ability of the skaters to organize around this issue, they were also able to utilize their connections just because of the visibility of the space and the fact that it had existed for so long, to have a planning lawyer help them designate the Undercroft area as an asset of community value. And that was under London's 2011 Localism Act. And so all of those efforts together are really what helped the skaters be able to negotiate with the Southbank Centre organization and result in the preservation of the Undercroft. And they were actually able to enter into a formal organization between what had become an organization, a formal organization, Long Live Southbank. And you can see how they've captured that like brutalist column there in the image, "You Can't Move History," and then the Southbank Centre entity. So, there were very effective tools used by skaters in London, and in Philadelphia, there were certainly protests around Love Park that were extensive, but they didn't really have the same organized response as London. And so many people involved in both these efforts have attributed Southbank Centre being preserved to that sort of sophisticated response that the skaters were able to organize around when their space was threatened. And so while I think and know that this type of organizing is not new to preservationists, it's important to look at these types of spaces that fall outside of what we would typically consider what is something perhaps worth saving. And I think it brings an important lens to the questions that preservationists can ask themselves, especially where and when they can assist in grassroots efforts and perhaps have their perceptions challenged. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you. This is a photo of my good friend Amber Gedman that I took skating in Point State Park, which is a public park down in Pittsburgh City Center. And there you can see Heinz Field, where the Steelers are playing football across the river. I can be reached. There is my email if you have any follow-up questions, and you can find me on Instagram at my Haptas hello.
Thank you so much, Maya. And if you have questions for her, go ahead and start throwing them in the chat end of the Q&A, which we will dive into after our Cats of Brutalism presentation.
Hi, I'm Emily Battaglia, along with Madeline Ong and Michaela Sine, who actually isn't here today, but we are three Master of Architecture students at the University of Buffalo. Our pronouns are she and her. And hopefully me and Maddie will be graduating this fall, and Michaela will be graduating in the spring, and we're kind of the people behind the Instagram account of Cast of Brutalism. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in the fall of our 2020 semester at UB, in the studio led by Gregory Delaney and Brett Doster, the three of us were originally set out to gain attention around the preservation of Paul Rudolph's Niagara Falls Public Library. It's a brutalist structure that has been receiving community backlash since its completion in 1969 and has been facing a lot of questions for its future. The architecture style of brutalism became a growing international style in the 1950s following the modernist movement. The exposure of raw materials, textures, and heavy massing makes the styles kind of stick out and are meant to have a heroic, monumental feel to them. So as we moved out of the modernist phase, brutalist buildings like Paul Rudolph's Yale Art and Architecture Building and the Earl W. Bridges Library were exposed to underrepresentation and negative feelings due to the style. We started our research knowing that we wanted to look into Paul Rudolph's career from a broader stance, while also looking at the struggles associated with brutalism. So as we looked more into the style of brutalism, we identified the style to be underrepresented. In addressing the challenges posed, we set out to develop a project that pressed into the style period in association, not only as a means of design and social commentary, but as a way to engage the broader public. We were inspired by a few social media brutalism accounts, such as Brutalism, which has 16.6 thousand followers, Mr. Collins Design, who has 40,000 followers, and SOS Brutalism, who also has 50,000 followers. However, our goal wasn't to just create an architecture page that primarily attracted the attention of an audience already engaged with the realm of architecture, but to reach outside to an audience who weren't technically interested in architecture and took this as an opportunity to teach and inform people about the style of brutalism. So with our initial goal, to create something that would create a conversation with the general public. So we were interested in broadening our audience beyond those interested with the architecture realm and knowledge of brutalism. So how do we go about doing that? By introducing cats to these structures. The page directly is feeding off of the social media and internet's obsession with cats as a phenomenon, such as pages like Cats of Instagram, which have a following base of 12.6 million followers, Fat Cat Art, who has 260,000 followers, and Owl Kitty, who has 750,000 followers. The purpose of Cats of Brutalism is to attract people with two different interests and familiarize them with the new one. So the page combines the warm softness of a cat with the all too often perceived as cold and harsh textures of brutalism, giving a new interpretation on the style and viewing in a different light than what brutalism is normally perceived as. The form of brutalism is a complex and unique structure that is desirable to cats. So thus, the strong qualities of materiality, massing, and lighting of these buildings play a unique opportunity once the cats have been enlarged. These two contrast, yet balance each other out by joining two communities together and spreading awareness not only for an architecture style that is not familiarized by the average person, but also shifting attention to cats that are either up for adoption, or it's just a fun way to display the beloved cats of our followers on their favorite brutalist building.
So yes, in photoshopping giant monolithical cats onto these buildings, we are creating a black and white representation of these buildings. However, the whole point of the page is to create conversations, questions, and display a new light on how these buildings could be perceived to a community that isn't familiarized with the architectural style or do not have any architectural backgrounds. So we are rather surprised and very thankful for the amount of support we have gained following the creation of the page. We started the Instagram page on October 7th, initially wanting to reach at least 1,200 followers, an estimation on the amount of followers our personal accounts receive from friends and family. At the end of the semester, which was about 2 months of the page being active, we had gained 15,000 followers. Today, 7 months after the end of the fall 2020 semester, we now have over 90,000 followers. As we gained more of a following, we saw more engagement from our followers relating to our posts. whether it was them mentioning personal stories or on buildings or relating the cats in our posts to their own pets, which is why we believe the page has become so popular due to the sense of community and connection people have with some posts. Our audience has really contributed to our growth in content, and we generated a website in order for our followers to become more engaging with us, allowing them to submit their own cat and building requests. Through this, it led to opening more doors for the public to be involved in making the content, some even sending us their own collages. By having an audience assist in the creation of our content, we are able to promote works of brutalism, not only from well-known architects, but also smaller regional architects and firms as well. There is no further accreditation between architects other than displaying their names. Each post is treated equally as a way to celebrate brutalist architecture from all over the world. We strongly believe that this page hasn't just allowed us to have a voice in the architecture and preservation world, but it also allows us for our followers to have a voice as well. As we have built this community through Instagram, we have opened the door for people to share their hometowns' brutalist structures and have heard many stories about the community getting involved to save their beloved buildings. Us receiving and creating posts is our way of listening and sharing these stories. As our audience continues to increase, we hope to bring light to current brutalist buildings under threat, but also highlight well-known buildings and other brutalist buildings that have been demolished. Our goal is to bring attention to the style and show how versatile in form and materials the architectural style can be. We want to pursue sharing more brutalist preservation petitions on our stories, since we have gained such a large voice within the architecture community. As our page continues to grow, we hope that the perception towards brutalism has changed, or at least is looked at more with an open mind. Thank you for taking the time to listen and joining us here today and sharing our story for Cats of Brutalism.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated those two talks on the recent past. You know, we collectively as a historic preservation field struggled to preserve brutalism. So it's really interesting to hear that the public feedback component and figuring out ways to connect people to their personal narratives has helped develop the account. You know, we can't always convince someone to love an architecture style, but we can connect people to places, whether it's a brutalist skateboard park, or maybe it's a brutalist library where they went to in college. So to everybody attending, if you have questions for our speakers, go ahead and start throwing them into the chat or the Q&A box. Otherwise, I'd love to start with Maya. So you brought up that a lot of skateboard spaces are impermanent, and you know they could be constructed of plywood and other more impermanent materials. But as you also noted in our pre-talk, you know, when we look at mid-century landscape design, we can see a lot of skateboard parks and more active spaces involved. So have you explored partnering your advocacy for skateboard spaces with landscape architecture and design existing groups? Have they been interested in collaborating with you?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Since I haven't been as involved in specific efforts, you know, it's not as relevant to me. However, I think it brings up a really important point, which is like, not only can preservationists be looking at, you know, and people interested in those issues be looking differently at what should be preserved and, you know, permanent and impermanence and how things are captured, but also, you know, as someone who has, you know, my feet in both worlds, right, of the architecture and preservation community and the skateboard community, it's also about turning around to the skateboarding community and saying, you know, you can go to the preservationists and ask for help. You can ally yourself with landscape architects and affiliated fields, and you can talk to the people who are advocating for brutalist architecture and you know, learn from them as well. And I don't know that there's a lot going on that's sort of providing a lot of, context between the two. So I think that's really relevant here.
I feel like skateboard parks connects to, in preservation, a lot of what we perceive as historic is based on what is academically perceived as historic, right? And skateboard has barely even been recognized as a sport. It's just now a part of the Olympics.
Right.
So I just, I think we have this interesting, again, skateboard has been more tied to pop culture. It has been more tied to an entire arena that has been undervalued. But Jacqueline is wanting to know, she says, everyone has brought such joy to all of the projects. Do all of you have particular sites that speak to you?
Sure. I mean, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I'll just say, the indoor skate park where I hold my events that I started skating at with my son is actually an old bowling alley that was repurposed into a skate park. And the lanes were actually reused as like the countertops in the skate shop. And there's old graffiti on the back of the building, like where you skate, that actually was the old pin boys who used to drop the pins for the bowling. So they preserved a bunch of really cool elements and then also did this amazing design that you can skate in. So for me, that was my initial sort of like jumping off point too, which was like too hard to kind of bring into necessarily the talk today, but it's a space I love to be in. I hear that the wheels of the skateboard, I'm inspired to be in it and see that this space was transformed, from one use into another. And so for me, I think that's another thing that really got the initial wheels spinning.
And I think for myself, I really enjoy, even though I haven't been to many of the buildings we've posted, the ones that pose like the question of if it's brutalist or not, such as like the Marina City in Chicago, which are these kind of like corn on the cob looking concrete structures. But I really just love having those discussions on those buildings about like, why is this considered brutalism or whatnot. I think that's like one of the fun parts about whole like community being involved in showing brutalism and whatnot.
I think one of my favorite sites for brutalist architecture is the building Habitat 67 by Moshe Safdie in Montreal, Quebec. I haven't been, but I guess just running the page, we run into so many we dive deep into so many different buildings, and it's just really cool seeing how versatile the use of concrete can be transformed into.
So as a follow-up, one of the huge reasons why people argue against preserving brutalism is they say the buildings can't be adapted beyond what their original use was. What are some great examples you've seen for adaptive use of brutalist buildings? Anything in particular beyond the IKEA?
I'm not sure if I could name an example like right off the top of my head that's maybe been, I know in Japan there's a few, I just can't think their names, that actually like allow the environment to kind of grow around them. But there's also many like the Salk Institute, I think, and also the Giselle Library, which are both in California actually, that I think with how they've been used and preserved have kind of brought a light to the style of brutalism. And I don't think many people actually even realize that some of them are brutalist structures. But I do agree that sometimes they might be a little disconnected with the environment, but I think that's also the whole point of them is to be like organic. So I don't know, Maddie, I don't know if you know any examples off the top of your head.
I think there's this one in New York City. It's one of the Juilliard buildings. I think the Alice Hall that's been transformed into having like a new addition to it. I think it's been done by FX Collaborative, and it's just like the addition of like a glass entrance that sometimes I think like the transformation of brutalist architecture is like in a way it's like it's okay, but then it also like, I feel like, in my opinion, it disrupts the original idea of it.
Yeah, I don't think the answer really has been solved yet on how to keep brutalism a brutalist structure basically without kind of bringing glass and modern ideas to it. It's been a challenge I've seen in renovations.
Maya Dash wants to know, has advocacy on preservation of skate parks improved stateside since the loss of Love Park?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think the answer is definitely yes. I mean, just as, you know, skateboarding's gaining visibility going into the Olympics and just becoming more widely recognized and accepted. And I think misperceptions of skateboarders are changing as well. It's definitely happening that advocacy efforts have improved. I know specifically in Seattle, there was a big push around, I believe it was called the Ballard Bowl. And I'm not sure whether the specific spot was preserved, but the outcome of it was actually a wider master plan for skateboarding and skate parks in this city of Seattle. And so now they have this really effective master plan for skateboarding. They have a very active local organization there called Skate Like a Girl, which was recently involved in the design and implementation of a new skate park just below the Space Needle, so right in the city center. So we're kind of like bringing it back to that point where it's, again, it's downtown, it's recognized. And there's a, you know, I think a growing push in public space design just to create spaces that are more inclusive overall of all different types of uses. So you know, that's something too, I think is really important, that we're not just designing skate parks just for skateboarders, but that we're really looking at how all people can like exist in public together and enjoy spaces.
Wonderful. We've got a two-part question for Cats. We have Stephen from YouTube wondering, what opportunities has this Instagram opened up for you that you're most excited about? And then we've gotten a couple people wondering, after you graduate, what happens to the account?
I think one awesome opportunity, we actually had the New York Times reach out to us right at the end of the 2020 semester. They just wanted to kind of feature us in their top 5 architecture, not even architecture, just top 5 Instagram accounts to follow. I think that was one of the biggest kind of opportunities and excitement for us that has been brought to the account. And I mean, we are hoping to expand in the future. We've been throwing out ideas, but
there's someone on YouTube, Jason, who wants to know, are there other forms of architecture that could use a cat? Or maybe it's other critters for other buildings, giraffes and skyscrapers? I don't know. Let's see, what else do we have?
I think for cats, I think brutalism really pairs together because of the fact that like they look like playable objects. So when we like enlarge in them, it just looks like a giant playfield for them.
we have had other people like ask us if we should start like other architecture accounts though with other animals for pairing, such as dogs of modernism. We've had a lot of ideas thrown out at us. So definitely, I was gonna say the future of the account is definitely to keep continuing it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if we will start another account that has a different animal featured, but it has been a possibility been thrown out to us.
Well, Restore Oregon has actually put out a pets and preservation calendar the past couple years. So maybe there are, opportunities abound. And Michael Allen even wants to know, when's the merch drop?
We're working on it.
Okay, in time for the holiday season?
That would be great if we can. That has been a discussion since the start, but we hope we could at least get maybe a calendar or something out there.
All right. Well, let us all know if there's a Kickstarter at some point.
We will.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and joining us in this virtual space. Really appreciate that so much. And I'd love for all of you to share just some takeaways with us or some food for thought that we should keep considering. Let's start with you, Maya.
Sure. Really for me, through this whole experience, it has been about wanting to advocate in general just for more multi-use public spaces and getting away from design, whether it's parks or plazas, and just making them more welcoming for all people. Currently, you know, I sort of get on my soapbox about when we're piping music into public space and what that can do to alienate certain people and who it's attracting and maybe detracting and what it detracts from. So, you know, there are bigger issues that this makes me think about, and that's really exciting to me. And then I also just want to plug really quickly this fantastic book, Skateboarding in the City by Ian Borden. So if you're interested in like really a deep dive into sort of the academics of this, I would highly recommend this book.
Thank you. Can you throw the name of the book in the chat too? And Katz, what about you? I feel like you already thoughtfully explained that in preservation, we can be talking to ourselves a lot, but what else should we be considering when we think about talking outside of our silos?
I think a main thing is, even though our page is based around like the digital world and community, the preservation of not just buildings, but even like community parks and places is a great way to just kind of gain like a community, just to learn from our peers and kind of get away from not just, you know, the politics around buildings and all the crazy stuff, but just to be able to enjoy these beautiful like pieces of art. Really is what architecture is to me. And I think a lot of people should start exploring these places more and seeing what there is that these places kind of provide for the community.
Yeah, I think running the account and just seeing the enthusiasm from our followers and like displaying buildings in their hometowns is like, it's really nice to tie into, like, even though it's like in the digital world, it's nice for people to be able to like look at some random building if like they're not in architecture, and it'll bring them like closer to a sense of pride and stuff. So I think that's pretty cool.
Oh, thank you. While the conversation we've just had is very different than some talks that happened earlier today, they said something along the lines of preservation's been looking at a house when instead we need to be looking at the home. And I feel like that's what you all have resonated in from a very different angle. It's about our communities first, and then moving on to the built remnants of those. So again, thank you so much for those presentations. They were wonderful. And to everyone in our audience, I hope you'll join me at 5 p.m. Eastern for Preserving Housing Autonomy. They'll be delving into strategies, including housing cooperatives, community land trust, and tenant organizing, employing preservation toward larger goals of resident empowerment and autonomy. So thank you everyone for being here today, and have a great